Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. And we have with us Olga Oliker, who is with the Russia program here at CSIS. You were a key player in the fascinating discussion yesterday with a bunch of Russian academics seeing sort of a Russian perspective as you guys were trying to work out a U.S. Russia roadmap. Tell us a little bit about the event and what were some of the key takeaways? You know, what were some of the perspectives of folks that many in the United States would consider sort of more adversary than ally?
So the report that we released yesterday is the product of over a year of work by us and the Russian International Affairs Council, who is CSIS's partner in Moscow on this. And the idea was to actually plot out a way forward for U.S. Russian relations. We started at a time when they were in particularly bad shape. Took us a while to figure out how we were going to do it. But what we ended up doing was having a series of meetings and then asking Russian and American pairs of authors to write on key issues: economics, strategic stability, European security, and basically by forcing an American and a Russian to co-author each piece and then the rest of us to look them over, we thought that it would be kind of a microcosm of some of the issues. And it was really a very useful exercise. I think in a lot of ways there's agreement on the areas in which we need to move forward. There's a challenge in actually moving forward. Andrei Kartunov, my counterpart, the guy from who directs the Russian International Affairs Council and who led this effort from their side, said yesterday that unilateral concessions tend to go poorly. They tend to be seen as a sign of weakness. And that is the challenge, that historically Russia sees any step back by the U.S. as a sign of weakness, any step forward as a threat. I think the problem is in the current environment, with the Russians having undertaken an effort to take a lot of steps forward of their own, the United States actually has a version of the security dilemma as well. We don't feel as threatened by the Russians, but we're starting to feel threatened in a lot of different areas by Russia, which makes cooperation and coordination, even in these things that we fundamentally agree must go forward, that much harder.
Do you think, what are some ways forward in the relationship, right? Because if you look at it, there are those who have been Russia watchers who've been saying that, you know, if you look at it from a Russian perspective, Russia has been pushing forward on a whole broad array of fronts because of the change in administration, whether it's becoming a little bit more assertive in Ukraine to see what's going to happen. Obviously, from a political meddling standpoint, that's obviously under investigation in the United States. We have Marine Le Pen is in Moscow now meeting with Vladimir Putin, who's insisting that he's not trying to steer the outcome of the election, even though there's ample evidence, whether it was Brexit, whether it was in the Wilders, you know, in the campaign in the Netherlands and elsewhere, that Russia is involved. What are, and then other incidents and things like that that have happened since. What are some ways for the United States to push back in this relationship in a more strategic fashion?
So I think there are a few things to unpack in your question. It's actually a fairly complicated equation we're looking at. The Russians pushing forward is new because the Russians had been, we thought, complacent. In fact, I think they thought weak and unable to move for quite a long time. They started pushing long before this election. I think we need to differentiate a little bit between Russia looking for opportunities and looking for ways to weaken the broad security system, which it thinks is not in its interest, and what it's successful at doing, right? We can't conflate intent and effectiveness. So, you know, we don't know. We hope we will find out the details of Russian involvement in the U.S. election. But saying that the Russians were interested in trying to influence it is not the same as saying that they influenced it, right? That the Russians are working with fringe parties throughout Europe, they have been for a long time. Does that actually turn elections or not? We don't know. What we do know they can do is use force, comparatively judiciously, but with a lower bar than we thought they had for it. So I think that is an interesting question to ask ourselves. Where is that going to happen again? And what U.S. interests does that threaten, and how big a priority are those interests? And I think with a new administration here in Washington, we don't actually know how the U.S. priorities shake out. So we don't know what we want to oppose and how we might oppose it. And I think that really is the challenge. Not knowing what U.S. policy is makes it very difficult to think through how we respond to Russian actions.
What should the alliance-wide strategic response to Russia be? There are those who look, for example, at the sanctions regime and say that, yes, it's great that we impose sanctions. They did have a measure of influence on Russia. On the other hand, there are those who would look at it and say, well, the sanctions haven't been updated, like any sanctions regime that's not regularly updated. Russia continues to be provocative in Ukraine. We now have Russia's recognition of passports from Donbass and from the areas that it's taken in order to basically like give it diplomatic recognition. Obviously, it remains to be seen how many other countries are going to follow suit on that. But, have we been on a good strategic path in sort of the deter, shape Russia, or is there another strategy that's required alliance-wide in order to try to be something that might be more effective?
So the sanctions are about Ukraine. And I would argue that the sanctions have been effective in a number of ways, in part because they demonstrated a unified Western response. And the Russians didn't expect that level of response. Now, they made the best of it, right? In some ways, the sanctions work for Russia now, and there certainly is, as you may recall, the Russians imposed counter-sanctions, which actually in many ways hurt their economy and certainly the Russian public in ways that the original sanctions did not, by banning agricultural products from Europe. On the other hand, this has led to Russian agricultural firms becoming lobbyists for those sanctions at least staying on. So in some ways, the Russians didn't expect this sort of response, but they've made the best of it, and it's worked for them. At the same time, maintaining the response is important. I don't think there is a will to go to war for Ukraine. There is a will to continue to say to the Russians, hey, this is not something we're happy with, and this is an issue for us. We don't want to fight a war over it, but we're willing to do a lot of other things. And I think the sanctions do that, and that's important. The other piece of this is other vulnerabilities that Russia exploits with an aim, at least kind of the maximalist aim for Russia would actually be the dream for Russia, would be NATO falls apart. So looking for weaknesses in NATO is something it's doing. And here I think the trick is making sure that NATO is strong. Russia's exploiting weaknesses. Russia's not the cause of the weaknesses. So the solution is to shore up the strengths. The solution is a lot of practicing what we preach in NATO. It's about working together. It's about being the unified alliance based on the values that we do share for as long as we share them. If we cease sharing those alliances, well, then the Russians maybe have a point, right? And we do have to ask ourselves what the value of the alliance is if we don't, in fact, share the security interests and share the values. I believe that we do.
Is Russia ever going to leave Ukraine?
Well,
or is there anything that we can do to convince Russia to leave Ukraine? Let's put it that way.
So I would separate Crimea and eastern Ukraine in this context. I think Crimea politically in Russia would be very difficult to back away from. And I also don't know what Ukraine would do, to be completely honest, if Russia were to say, fine, never mind, it's yours again. There's a lot of water under that peninsula link, or I don't know, that land bridge. There's a lot of water under that land bridge. Eastern Ukraine, it's interesting, when I was in Moscow in late October, early November, I was struck by two things. One, to the extent to which Russians I talked with were comfortable saying, yeah, the Russian military is in Ukraine, yeah, it's true. And the extent to which people thought it had been a mistake, not Crimea, but the involvement in East Ukraine. They thought it was a mistake. Different people thought it was a mistake for different reasons, right? Some people thought that Russia should have marched to Kiev and taken control of Ukraine as a whole. Others thought they shouldn't have gotten involved in the first place. But there was a lot of agreement that it hadn't gone that well. I think right now, with a new administration in Washington, they're not quite sure what they want. And meantime, you also have this dynamic in Ukraine that the Ukrainians aren't sure what they want. There's been so much demonization of these regions that they'll say are occupied, but that they also, to some extent, don't trust. There was a blockade to stop all trade with them, and the Ukrainian government originally opposed it, but then sort of went over and said, fine, we'll cease all trade with these regions. It raises the question of, why are they fighting a war for something they don't want? And I think I think how this gets resolved is going to be a very interesting question. Now, in terms of Russia getting out of Ukraine, you can certainly look to Russian forces being out of East Ukraine, Russian support to the separatists ending, Minsk being implemented. That's the point of Minsk. In terms of getting Russian influence entirely out of Ukraine, well, they're next door. So one way or another, whatever happens going forward, particularly, I would say, in the best case scenario, Ukraine and Russia do have to find a modus vivendi. And I think Russia's invasion has made that very, very difficult. But there's no other alternative. You can't cut yourself off from a country that's right there on your border.
One last question. If you talk to Swedes, Norwegians, others across Europe, they talk about the active measures, the disinformation campaigns that Russia has been very effectively using. Nothing new, obviously, something that Russia did, Soviet Union did throughout the Cold War, but something that has been highly refined. There are Europeans who get their news from RT and start to mirror an RT view of the world. I was talking to a French friend of mine, and well, you know, look, a little bit reminiscent of what President Trump said. You know, well, you know, we have killers too. You know, it's like, well, you know, we in France, we've done a lot of very bad things too. Sort of an equivalency argument that you see creeping into the political narrative. What do governments have to do to counter that? You know, because then there's criticism, right? Whether you're going to have government truth squads and things like that. But if you look at it, some of these rumors have been very, very damaging, for example, in Sweden and Norway and other countries, you know, whether it's in Germany, you know, and even, you know, France and elsewhere. What are some of the ways to counter that kind of messaging?
So I would say the best way to counter the accusations of being a hypocrite is not to be a hypocrite, right? Don't do those things. And don't make up your own facts. Do practice transparency and accountability. Do practice what we preach. Show that this can work without relying on lies and subterfuge. Be honest with your press so that your press is able to report. I mean, I do think all of these things are at the core of the response. And then over time, I think education is also at the core of the response, teaching people the critical thinking skills that they need, yes, to absolutely, you know, as RT says, question more. But as you question more, that doesn't mean believe every conspiracy theory that gets thrown at you. It means question more and understand the logic and know how the world works and draw your own conclusions based on facts. Don't draw your own conclusions based on propaganda.
Olga, thanks very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.